Welcome to the Inflectra webinar recording of the SpiraTeam and SpiraPlan Agile Development webinar. Thank you for joining. Today we're going to be talking about how to use SpiraTeam and SpiraPlan for Agile development, for the planning of sprints, backlogs, how to use it in Scrum and Kanban methodologies. During the presentation, I'll be going through different parts of the application. Please feel free to ask questions at the end of each section, and I will make sure we have time for that. We have 1 hour allocated for the webinar, but it may not take that long, depending on how many questions we have and where we want to go. So just to start out, I've installed a sample project for today's webinar, and the project right now is very basic. We're going to start populating it during the demo. So ahead of time, I've created the project called Webinar Project. And I've created 3 components in the administration. I've created an administration, a billing, and a reservation section, and they're all empty. So for today's demonstration, we're going to be using a fictitious airline reservation as our subject matter that we're going to plan out. I've also gone ahead and created in the releases section, I've created one release called Release 1.0 with 3 individual sprints, sprints 1, 2, and 3. I have also created a second release, and I have not yet created any sprints for that. For this sample, I have made the first release contain the 3 sprints in series. So each of the sprints follows on to each other sequentially. But you could, of course, create the sprints in parallel, running at different times. Okay, great. So in the latest version of SpiraTeam, we added this new planning board that replaced the old planning features. And from this planning board, you now have the ability to directly add requirements and user stories into the planning board. So I just created one example to start with. I created a requirement that is for creating a new itinerary for a simple round-trip flight. So let me show you how I did that. I'm going to create a second user story for a multi-city flight. So let me choose the option to add. This brings up this new add requirement screen. And in this, you can enter as much information as you wish and leave the fields that are not required blank. So let me add a user story to user needs to be able to create or define a multi-city itinerary. So I'm just entering this information. You should be able to choose the starting city, intermediate, and ending cities. I can change the type if I wish. I'll leave it as is for now. Notice that it initially starts out in the requested status. All new requirements and stories will start out in that status. I have decided at this point not to give it a priority and not to give it a release or a component. I could do that at this stage, or I can do it later on in the planning board as I do it part of the backlog grooming. For this particular project, we can enter a estimate at this point. So let me make it a 1.5 story point. If I add the requirement, you'll now see it added in the list next to one we already created. The first one I created was a 1.0 story point. The new one is a 1.5. That means that the new requirement is 1.5 times bigger than the original requirement. And the other thing I'm going to do is let's add another story and put it into the administration section. So we go to administration. You notice when I choose the add button, it's now going to put it directly into the administration component for me. And for this one would be administrators need to be able to see all itineraries from all users. Okay, so this is the user story, and that's going in administration, and that's a little more complicated, so we'll make it 2 story points. Okay, so now we've got at the top in our unassigned items, we've got these 2 stories, and we've got one in administration. So the first thing I'm going to do is categorize these, so I can use the planning board to simply select by clicking on them, and you notice that the border goes red, and I can now drag it directly down into the reservations. So now I have 1 story in administration and 2 in reservations. So now I'll take the opportunity to explain a little bit about how the planning board works. So what you have is different views. Initially, when you first come in, you're in the product backlog view. This is going to show us all of the features that have been thought of that have not yet been allocated to a particular release or to a particular sprint. We're also showing the detail view. This lets us show the full story card with the name of the requirement, the number, the icon, the estimate, and these two other numbers underneath, one of which represents the number of development tasks and the other one that represents the number of test cases, and they're both initially 0. I can also choose to display any linked tasks or linked test cases. Now there aren't any yet, so that won't do anything, but when I start to add tasks and test cases, I can see them as part of my requirement story card. If I turn off detail view, it gives me a more compact view where I don't have to worry about seeing all the information, and it lets me see more on the screen. So depending on the size of the screen you're using, and depending on which stage of the planning you're in, you may decide to use the detailed view or the regular view. The other thing I can do is categorize and slice it in different ways. So this is the product backlog view. This is available in 4 views. The first view is by component, which are the main areas of the system. I can also do it by package. I'll show you that one in a second. Also, I can do it by priority, and I can do it by status. The status is the Kanban view. So right now, all of my features are in this requested state. So I could decide right now to approve all of these, or perhaps we're going to review some. So perhaps these 2 we're going to move to under review, and maybe this one we're going to move directly to accepted. Oops, I had them all selected. Let me take that back, put that back to the review. So you can multi-select. If you have them all selected, it's going to move all of them. If you just have one selected, it's going to move just that one. And if you see the red border, that shows you what's highlighted at any time. Okay, great. Now, in terms of the package view, that view lets you see the requirements organized by their parent requirement. And so one of the things about SpiraTeam is that you've always got the regular requirements view as well. And right now, all of our requirements are actually in this flat hierarchy. So if I do the package view, it's not going to show me anything useful. So what I might want to do is create a parent requirement called maybe user stories. All my stories can be entered that. So now when I go back to my planning board and choose the by package review, you'll see they're all listed under user stories. So that way, if you've got a more complex hierarchy, you can actually organize the stories under these epics on the left-hand side corresponding to the hierarchy. If you don't want to bother with that, you can just leave it as a flat list. It's up to you. Now, if I go back to the detail view, you'll notice that right now there's this colored indicator bar here that's empty. That bar will show you the progress of the requirements. Initially, it's going to be gray, like this, meaning that nothing's happening, no tasks. As you add development tasks and those tasks move through their life cycle, you will see the status of those requirements change. You'll see a green bar move from left to right, and we'll see that shortly. So, as I mentioned, this is the backlog view. Before we move into the individual releases and sprints, the other thing we can do in this view is groom the backlog. So, for example, if I go back to the by priority view, I can view all my requirements. They're currently all unassigned. They're all equal priority. And if I go here, I can decide which ones are the highest priority. So, for example, let's put this one, the ability to create an itinerary for a round trip. That's very important to us. Everyone needs to do that. So we'll put that as a critical requirement. The administrative functionality, maybe that's a very high requirement. So let's put that one in high. And then the ability to define a multi-city itinerary, that's also pretty high. So we'll put that as well. Okay. Now, sometimes you also need to be able to prioritize them within a group. So, for example, this one, the ability to do a multi-city flight, maybe that's more important than the administrative view, but it's still the same priority. So you can reshuffle them within the view, like that. So you now have the ability to shuffle the cards within a particular category, as well as the formal priority setting. So that way you can groom your backlog by component, by package, by priority, and you can view it by status to see which requirements are ready for the next stage, which is to put them into a particular release. Before I do that, any questions so far? Okay. Okay. So the next thing we're going to be doing is now looking at the tasks and how we interact with the requirements to add tasks and test cases to them. Someone just joined? Okay, great. So what we'll do is, if you look at one of these requirements, let's take this first one, the ability to create a simple round-trip flight. We can click on that, and we can add some tasks to it. So if we go into the tasks view, let's add a couple of different tasks. We'll add the first task, which is to create the user interface. So create the screen to display or to accept the start and end airports. Okay. And let's add another task to create the screen to display the matching flights. And maybe the third thing would be create the screen to review the itinerary before moving on to the next page. So these are the three things that the developers will have to do to create this story. So the entire story is essentially developed once this requirement is done. So and right now it inherits the priority from the requirement. So the original story requirement is priority 1, so each of the tasks inherits that. You could change it at this point. And all 3 tasks will be listed as not started, and they will also be marked as not complete and not started yet. Now the other thing we'll notice is their estimated effort is 0. Within SpiraTeam, you can individually estimate the tasks at an hour basis, and the system will then use that to calculate the velocity for each of your story points. So you can figure out, for this particular project, for this particular team, if I have a certain number of story points, how many hours is that going to take? And that's very useful when we do the resource planning, so we can look at bugs that we're fixing and see if we have enough time to fix the bugs in that sprint, as well as the development of tasks. So to add estimates, I will go in here and do a show estimated effort, and I can use the editing features to add some effort values. So we'll say the first one will take 5 hours, the second will take maybe 4, and the last one, the review, will take 4 again. So now we're given estimates. And now if we go back to our planning board view, you'll notice that we now have some tasks listed, 3 tasks on schedule, if you look at the tooltip for that requirement. And if we now choose the task view, you can now see there are 3 individual tasks displayed there under that requirement. So in this planning board view, you can see the requirement and you can see the tasks that make it up. And you can click on the links to go directly to any of those items that you wish. Now, the next piece, of course, is that under an Agile methodology, a requirement and a user story has to be paired with an acceptance test, because you have to be able to test your feature, your functionality, before you develop it using test-driven development. So an important thing is to be able to develop a test that defines the acceptance of that feature, of that user story. So we can do the same thing. If I go back onto that requirement, 46, I can go into test coverage, and I can create a test case directly from that requirement, like that, in one click. And if I now click on my test case, I can give it a little more information. So we're going to test that the user can create a new itinerary for a single round-trip flight. So I'll just change the name. And the next thing I want to do is add some steps. So let's add a few steps to this. And this steps will define the acceptance of this user story. So the first thing we're going to do is user enters the start airport name or code. System displays the match. Secondly, user enters the ending airport name or code. System displays the match. next user clicks review itineraries button, and the system will now display a list of matching flights. Or warning or error that no flights match. And the last one we'll do is user selects desired itinerary and clicks purchase. And that will end this particular user story. So then they'll move on to the next story, which would be to actually commit the flight and actually enter the building information and the passenger information. And that's a very simple test. And that defines how we're going to accept this feature. So this user story now has a matching acceptance test. And for this example, we've only created one test case, but maybe there could be several. So for example, in this case, you might want to create one test case for searching by airport name and another one for searching by airport code. Maybe there's different functionality, there's an autocomplete function, and so you might want to define them differently. So you have that flexibility to do that. Back on my planning board, if I refresh and choose test cases, you can now see that I've got my test cases and my tasks and my requirements all displayed here with one story card. So I can see at a glance everything that's related to this one feature. Before I move on, any questions? Okay, very good. So now we've created our backlog, and we only have 3 items in the backlog, and we only have tasks with the first one. So in a real situation, we need to go through the other requirements and add tasks to those as well. The next thing we want to do is look at our release view. So to do that, the next thing we'll do is choose the All Releases view. That's going to show me my 2 releases. I've only created 2 for this project, and it's going to show me the amount of time available for the first one and the second one. And what I can do then is go back to my backlog, which is here at the top. And then what I can do is then decide which functionality is going to be in each release. So let's say that our very first version of our reservation system is going to only handle round-trip flights, but it needs an administrative view. So we'll take this one, and we'll drag these both down to release 1. And then we'll take the multi-city flight, put that in the next version. Okay, oops. There you go. That's what I want to do. So now I've got my requirements in release 1, release 2. Now you'll notice I did drag this one into release 2 that was actually further back in the backlog. You can do that. The system has ordered them based on how I thought I was going to prioritize them, but you can drag and drop them the way you wish. It doesn't force you to take them in a specific order. And you can still reshuffle them. So in theory, you could decide that you wanted to make this multi-city itinerary available here, like that. And the other thing is I just realized I've actually dragged the wrong one. So you can move things around. And actually, this multi-city should be in release 2. And actually, it was the administrative functionality that's meant to be in release 1. So you can see, if I make a mistake, it's very easy to correct. So now I've got what I want, which is to have my new itinerary for a round trip, my administration functionality comes after it, and then the next release, multi-city. And so the nice thing with this view is I can do it in a meeting, and if I make a mistake, I can just drag things around. It's very flexible, it's very fast. This view is also designed to work on a tablet. You'll see we have these buttons here. That's because obviously on a tablet it's much harder to scroll. You can use the buttons, you can drag and drop with a finger. It's fully enabled for use on an iPad or an Android. So now I've done that, the next thing I'm going to want to do is look at how do I do my planning. So there's a couple of different views depending on the project. So let's choose this release, release 1, and we're going to plan this release out. So I click on release 1, and it's going to take me into the release plan. And from a Scrum situation, I have my 3 sprints, and I can then decide which of the 3 sprints I want to put these requirements in. If, on the other hand, I'm using a Kanban methodology, I'm going to be more concerned about the status and the flow of these through the release. Then I've got my status view. So in a strictly Kanban project, I'm not going to have any sprints, and I'm probably not going to have any tasks. I will be more concerned now about moving these features and tasks through the Kanban, through the flow. how many are in progress, how many are developed, and managing that flow so I don't have a bottleneck with all my requirements stuck in progress, stuck in the develop task. So I can ensure that I've got a certain number of cards in each of these steps. If I'm using a Scrum methodology, what I'll be more concerned about here is balancing out the amount of time in each sprint and making sure that I have completely executable functionality at the end of each sprint, which means that at the end of each sprint, the requirement must be fully developed and the test cases must be passed. So what we'll do, we'll start out by first taking our first feature, which is our ability to create a round-trip flight. I'm going to take that one and I'll put that in the first sprint. And then I'll take the second one, the administration, and we'll make that in the second sprint. In real life, you'd probably have more than 2 features, two user stories, and you'd have 2 or 3 in each sprint, and that's quite normal. You'll notice these numbers. The 3 shows me I have 3 tasks. Here they are. And then the lower number is the number of test cases. Okay, so now that I've done that, what I can do is also see who's actually working on these. Right now, these have not been assigned to anyone. So right now, there's no one actually working on these. So I can change the view to the per-person view, and that shows me everyone on the project. And you can see that right now, no one's been assigned anything. Okay, so let me go back to my iteration view. And what I'll do now is let's focus on the first sprint. So going to the first sprint, I'll click on it. I'm now in the sprint view, and I can see the release information, the sprint information. I can also see if anything's still in my backlog. Nothing is right now. And I can see that I have 1 user story that's currently planned for this sprint. And if I change the view for the sprint, I can also view it by person as well. So right now on the sprint, nothing's been assigned to anyone. So let me take this requirement and let me assign it to Fred. So now I've assigned it to Fred, which is great. Now the individual tasks, they can be assigned to different people. So you have that option as well. So what I can do is go into the tasks by person, and I could decide that maybe these 2 will be designed, Fred owns the whole story, so we'll give those to Fred. But maybe we'll give just the review screen to Joe. And if you notice that this colored bar now shows that person's allocation, and there's the small amount here, the amount that's allocated, 2%. So Joe has a bunch of time available for this particular sprint, and so does Fred, and so we've already started to allocate their time. So you can do workload analysis directly on this view, which is great. And similarly from a Kanban view of the sprint, I can also look at the status view. This one requirement right now is planned, and if I want to look at the individual tasks, they're all not started. So you've got these various different views to help you do the different levels. So in your sprint meeting, you'll be looking at these tasks, the task board, and viewing the progress of the tasks. You're also going to be looking at the tasks by person to see who's working on each of the tasks. You've then got your high-level sprint view, which lets you see for the sprint as a whole, the stories, where they are, and who's working on them. And then you have the release view, which lets you look at the whole release to see each of the sprints. And the indication bar tells you if you're behind or on schedule. So you've got these different levels of visibility within the single board that lets you see which of the requirements are in which sprint, what phase they're in, what status they're in within the sprint, and who's working on them. So in real time, you can move things between people, and you can see how things are moving through the system. As an example of that, if I go back to my sprint, and I take one of my tasks, and let's say we're going to move that task, the ability to take the start and end points, and let's say that one is now completed. And let's say that the one to review the itinerary, that one's in progress, and maybe the one to create the matching flights, that's in progress too. There you go. So now you can see that you have these different statuses. And if I go back to the requirement view, you'll see right here, this shows you the overall progress. The first task is green, meaning completed, 100%. The second 2 haven't yet started, they're in progress. And as we expend effort on them, you'll see that little bar move from left to right. But the nice thing is at the requirement level, I've got this indication that shows me visually how far along I am, that I'm 38% done, and 62% yet to go. So you can see at the requirement level, all per task, what's been going on. And so if I have lots and lots of requirements, I can scale that down, turn off the tasks, turn off the test cases, and I can still see the aggregate progress right here. Any questions? Okay, great. So that's the task side of things. So I've basically taken the task, I've finished one, the other two are in progress. Well, let's say that those two tasks, one of those is partially being done. So let's show you how that works. So this is the individual task. I'm not logged in as Fred right now, so I'm just going to pretend I'm Fred. But Fred would typically log in and either use the time card or use the screen to edit it. And basically, Fred's going to let us know how far along he is. So Fred's basically got 5 hours of work to do to build this screen. And let's say that he's actually spent 2 hours working on it. But unfortunately, he has 3 hours left because it's taken longer than we thought. There's more work to be done. And so this is more complex than first thought. So hit save. And you'll notice now that the estimated effort is 4 hours, the actual effort is 2, the remaining is 3. That means our projected is 5. Because what it's saying is that even though it originally was estimated as 4 hours, we've done 2, we spent 2 hours of time, but we really still have 3 hours left. So the total time if we were done at this point would be 5. So you can compare the projected against the estimates to see if your estimates are actually in line with plans or whether you're underestimating your work. And that will be used later on when we go back to the story points, and we can actually use this to actually readjust the conversion factor between one story point and how many hours. So we can see the team velocity and how it's changing. And visually, if we go back to our planning board, we'll now see that requirement, that task has gone from being yellow, meaning not started, to now showing that little green indication bar as basically being 25% done and 75% still to go. And that's adjusted the progress bar of that requirement. And if we do the same thing, if we go into this task here, and we'll do the same thing, we'll basically say it's got 4 hours are supposed to be done. Let's say we've spent 3 hours, but there's only 1 hour remaining, so we're pretty much on track. Save. And now if we go back to planning board and do refresh, you'll notice that that color bar has moved 3/4 of the way along. So that way you can see visually the indication of the progress. And if you want us to drill down, you can do that. You can drill down to the sprint level and you can choose to see by person. And if you want to see the individual tasks, you can do tasks by person to see how far along each of them are, or by status. These two are currently in progress, this one is done. And at some point we're going to be completely done, and you can either fill in the effort values individually, or you can simply drag them in bulk into completed. And now when I do that, if I go back to my release view, I see it's complete. The whole requirement's now gone green, and each of the individual tasks has gone green, so we're now done. So the requirement is now developed, and in fact you'll notice that the requirement has automatically moved from in progress to developed. That means the system has identified that all of the development tasks are done. The user story requirement automatically moves to developed without any additional work. And the last piece is the testing. So the testers are working, and it could be the developers or they could be someone different. They're obviously going to be working on the testing side. So what will happen is if I go into the testing side, there's that one test case. That test case has to be passed for that requirement to be fully ready, fully integrated, and the sprint to be over. And so what will happen is I would assign this to someone. Let's say we assign it to Amy. Amy's now going to be working on the test case. And I'll pretend I'm Amy and execute it. And just for today, I'm going to pass all the steps. So it's against release 1, sprint 1. We can pick a build from the build server. Next, we'll pass all the steps. Hit finish. And now it's been passed. And if we go back to our planning board view, hit refresh, you'll notice that the requirement and the task and the test case have all moved into tested automatically. Now the last thing to do would then be review this and then simply review it, either dragging it to completed through the planning board, or if you're using a formal sign-off process, you can go into the requirement and you can use the workflow to mark as completed. You have both options. If I use this option and say mark as completed and add a comment, signed off, hit save, every change I make in this view is reflected back in real time on the planning board in completed. So we've now moved that one requirement all the way from the initial conception, it's been prioritized, it's been put into the sprint, and it's completed. All the tasks have been developed, test cases have been passed, and it's done. And if I now go back up one level, back to my release view, I can now see this one release is fully done. Sorry, the sprint is fully done, and then now I move on to the next sprint in that release and do the same thing. So next what I would do is in this sprint, we now do this for planning for sprint 2, I would then break this requirement out into different tasks and assign them to different people, then we'd write the test cases and do exactly the same thing. Any questions? Okay, great. So that's how you would move the features, and from a Kanban perspective it works the same way, except you wouldn't be using the sprints, you would simply be using the status view, and you can then move the features through that view. So in a Kanban view, it works very similar, but we're working at a release level. What we'll do is simply take this requirement, we can decide to have tasks if we wish, or we can just use the requirement itself, and we write a test case to go with it, and we can then drag that requirement through into progress, developed, tested, through the same life cycle. And you can have a combination of the two. You can have a mixture of Kanban for some maintenance tasks, and you can use Sprint for some of the new tasks, and it can be working in the same project. Now, from a reporting standpoint, if we go back to the project homepage for this project, we're going to see what's been going on. So first of all, and this is the latest version of SpiraTeam. We've got a couple of new things that will be coming out in a few weeks. We've got this new activity stream, so I can see quickly what's been going on, and I can see what I've been working on. And obviously, I'm the only user in the system, so everything's going to be listed as belonging to me. But in a real environment, this would be very helpful because I can see the last actions that have been done by someone. But I can also see, for the project as a whole, the requirements test coverage. First of all of my requirements are completed. I can also see my burn down. And I can see for release 1 how many items we have and how many are left. And I can do the same thing for burn up, starting at the beginning, we're adding this much functionality, then adding that much, and then the bar at the bottom shows you how much you're doing each phase. And obviously that's the release-wide view. That's showing me the burn up from one release to the next. Oftentimes what I want to see though is within a release, how am I getting through the work for a particular sprint. So to do that, I can just change the drop-down list to the release. And now it's going to show me by sprint, right here. So that's my burn down by sprint. This is sprint 1, 3 story points, down to 2, and then down to 0 by the end of sprint 3. And this shows me how many I've accomplished in each sprint. The red is the remaining, and the blue is the ideal. And that's because in sprint 3 I haven't added anything in there yet. Similarly, we've got the velocity and the burn up. So the burn up looks like this. And the velocity will show me how much time we're spending. So this will show me how many story points we're actually achieving in each sprint. The blue line is the average, and then the green is the rolling average, so it adjusts for each sprint, and then the actual is the red. So you can see, is each sprint above or below the velocity? And if you remember, we had that issue where in that first sprint, we had a task that took longer than we thought, so our velocity may actually be lower. We're getting less done than we planned. Similarly, on the reporting view, we can go into the reporting page, and we can also report with the task graph. We have the same graphs available here, the burn down, the burn up, and the velocity. We can do it at the task level, and we can do it at the release level. Sorry, the requirement level. To add to the requirement level, we go to add items, go in here, and we can then choose the requirement graph, Add to the left side. When it refreshes, we now have a requirement graph with our burn down, and we have a task graph with our burn down. And it might be nice to see them side by side, so I can just drag it up here, and there it is. So that way I can compare both tasks and requirements to see the individual burn down. The task one gives you more detail because it's done in hours and it's done by individual tasks. The requirement is the aggregate for the story points by user story. If I go back to my project homepage, there's a couple other things that could be useful. You can see right now there's no late finishing tasks, but one of the things that might be interesting would be to see if there's any late starting tasks, things I have to worry about. I can go to Add Items, and I can go to my list of available widgets, and I can go in here and add the late starting tasks to the left side. Actually, it's the right side. And if there aren't any, I guess there aren't any late starting tasks will then appear here. So for example, if we go back into our planning board view, one of the things I might want to do is add a task to that other requirement and make that late starting. You'll now see that will be pulled out into the reporting dashboard. So SpiraTeam highlights things that are exception cases, things that you should be worried about. If there are tasks that are late starting, requirements that are late starting, you haven't got to go hunt for them, SpiraTeam will find them for you. So as an example of that, if I go into the task section and add a new task, so create screen to display list of itineraries, and I'll create another screen to display the details of one itinerary, basically a list in detail view. These are my two tasks. If I go back to the planning board, I can take those tasks, and let's say we're going to move that whole requirement to in progress. They're listed there. If I go back to my home page, then that's good. Their tasks are not late starting or late finishing. That's great. So now if we deliberately make a task that's late starting, we can simulate that. So what I'll do is we check the start date of my release is 5/21, which is today. So if I go into my task and I set the start date to be today, 5/21. Hit save. Now if I go back to my home page, it should pop out as a late starting task right there. So that way SpiraTeam is prompting you to find things that are exception cases. And similarly, if we were to create a late finishing task, the same thing will happen. We'll see it down here in late finishing, and it will go red. So to show you that, let's make another task late finishing. So what we'll do is we'll take the other task for this requirement, this one here, and we'll make this one late finishing. So what we can do is 5/21. We'll make it 5/21 also, but we'll deliberately start it. We'll make it finish. It's supposed to have also finished today. Hit save. And now we'll say start task. And we'll say we've got, it was a 1 hour task, well, a 2 hour task, and we've spent an hour, but all 2 hours are remaining. We've got nothing done. Maybe we've had a hard time trying to understand this and get this developed. And it's assigned to red. Okay. And so it's, now if we go back to the home page, I think that should be considered late finishing. And it's late finishing up right here. And that popped out. So that way, if you have a late finishing or late starting task, they're brought to your attention. They're not buried in the system. Any questions? Great. And the last piece that I want to talk about then is the resource view. So within the planning board, you do have a resource view available. So if we go back to the planning board, we can basically view the release by person and see that Fred's been working on this one, and right now no one else is working on the other one. And if I do the same thing for tasks, if I go to an individual sprint, let me choose sprint 1, I can do the same thing by tasks. So I can view the user stories and the task by person. So as well as this functionality, which you've already seen, there's also a central resource view. If I go tracking resources, I can view the people on the project and see essentially their allocation and how much time they have. So I can choose a particular release or sprint, and it'll show me how much time is available. And that gray bar shows there's a very small amount of green on the left, 2% allocated, and Joe's 1% allocated. If I change it to sprint 1, it gets a little bigger because it's a bigger percentage. And if I drill down, I can see everything that Fred's working on. I can see the requirements and the tasks to go with them. I can see any defects. We haven't been dealing with defects in this, and the test cases and the test sets. Now, defects is the next piece. So we've talked a lot about tests and we've talked a lot about tasks and requirements. The last piece of the planning board and the Agile planning functionality deals with defects. Now, that previous test case we had passed, which was very good, but let's suppose that had failed, or let's suppose someone found another defect, just generally. So let's do that. So let's log a defect. So let's say we found a bug. We found a bug when entering certain country codes. So there's a bug in the system. It's pretty high because it's new functionality and it's going to prevent me searching on things. And it was found in sprint 1, and it's when choosing IAD, Washington, DC, the airport, the city name is not matched correctly. So we found a bug in that very first sprint, which is the user story, that allows us to basically do a round trip search. And that's in the reservations, so we'll choose that, and we'll hit save. And we've logged our defect. Now the next thing we might want to do then is also link that. Because it wasn't done through a formal test case, I may want to link it to a user story, so I can choose add association, choose requirement, and then let me get my user story. I'll take that one about the simple itinerary for a round trip, and this bug impacts this user story. So that's a major issue, because that's the new functionality that was priority 1. So we add the association. Now the next thing we might want to do here is also assign this to someone or review it. So let's review it first of all. It's an open defect, and we want to fix that in release 1. Somewhere in release 1. We're not sure yet where, but it's got to be fixed in this release before we go live. I'm not yet sure who I'm going to assign it to, so let me hit save. Okay, now if I go back to my planning board, let me close some of these tabs off. If I go back to my planning board view, if I go back to my backlog, if I open up reservations, nothing in there yet. Let me go to my release view. There's my defect. Now I'd assigned that defect already to release 1. If I had not assigned it to release 1, it would have been in the backlog. So it depends on if you want to assign it directly to that release. When you log it, it will go straight into the release view, the release backlog. If you don't, it will end up in the product backlog along with the requirements. And there's my defect. And now I can decide, do I want to fix that in sprint 1? Well, sprint 1's already done, so maybe it makes sense to do this in sprint 2. So let's put that in sprint 2 right here. Great. And that way, when we start to look at the planning for sprint 2, maybe we are going to do Scrum after all, not Kanban. So let's put that requirement also in sprint 2. So now I've got my plan for sprint 2, and it can be a mixture of requirements along with the associated tasks, and if there are any test cases, those as well, and my defects. And the defects work the same way. If I go into that iteration, I can also then view the requirements, and I can view by person. Now the defects don't show up by status because unfortunately defects have different statuses that are customizable, so they don't show up there. They're going to be available in the release view, the sprint view, and then the person view. So let's say I take this defect, and right now everyone's doing nothing on this project, so let me give the defect to Joe, because he's got plenty of time available, and let me give this user story to Fred. So I can divide up my workload. So now I can see in the planning board view what Joe's working on, what Fred's working on. And then if I go back to my resources view, and I go to, I think it was Joe. Joe's now got requirements and tasks, and change it to sprint 2, and then I'll see the defect right there. So that way you can see at a glance everything that they're working on. And if you go back to the summary page, the same thing. I've changed it to sprint 2, and now you can see that Joe and Fred have both been working on different things. And that way I can then manage my defects and my requirements and tasks and test cases all within this visual planning board view. And I can drag and drop them. So perhaps Joe is busy, we're going to give him a requirement, I can then assign the task to the instance to someone else. And the last piece then is some of the configuration you can do. Before I go on to that, any questions? Okay, so the last piece is the administration side. I've set this up with a very basic configuration, but there's a lot of functionality and flexibility within SpiraTeam. So if you go into administration, and what you can do is go into the planning options section right here, and this lets you set some of the general parameters for the planning overall. So it lets you set the number of hours per day and working days per week. By default, it will be 8 hours a day and 5 days a week. But we all know that really there often aren't 8 hours a day. There's meetings and other scheduled activities. So many times companies will want to plan to a 6-hour working day, knowing that there's going to be other times that are not available. And so when you estimate your tasks and defects by hour, and those roll up to your requirements, story count, you can adjust that factor to make sure you're not over-scheduling each day. The other thing is going to be, do we want to include different effort values? So when we look at a particular release or sprint, how much time is available in it, in the date range? Do we want to include tasks? Do we want to include defects? Do we want to include test cases? So each of those different elements in the planning board, they have different effort values. And if your developers are going to be writing the test cases and running them, then obviously you need to account for that running time. If you have a QA team that's essentially separate, you may want to exclude that time. So it gives you that flexibility. We also have the ability to set up some defaults so that when you first create a user story, the system, if I had left it blank, would automatically fill it with 1 story point. The idea being that that's your default, and then things are either bigger or smaller than 1. So that way, if something's twice as big as the default, it's a particularly complicated piece of functionality, you can give it a 2 story point. If it's something that's maybe half as complicated as the average, you can give it 0.5. And so you can set that default value up. The other thing it will do is let you figure out how many hours correspond to a story point based on that team's velocity. And the system will actually now analyze the work done to date. And based on the current tasks you have in the system, it's actually suggesting that 3.5 hours would match the current team's velocity. And you can then apply that change going forward, which will then realign your estimates. And as the team progresses, you may want to revisit this at periodic points, maybe the end of each sprint, so as you begin the next sprint, you can adjust your estimates and your resourcing accordingly. There's also some time-saving options in the system that you can choose to have or not have. The first thing is the auto-planning. When you first assign a release or a sprint to a requirement, it automatically moves in that Kanban view from not started to planned. You can decide whether you want that or not, or whether you want someone to physically have to drag it in the planning board. It's entirely up to you. The second thing is, when all the tasks that are linked back to a requirement become completed, the requirement automatically moves to developed. If you remember, you saw that. And similarly, when all the test cases are passed, we saw that requirement automatically move to the tested status. Depending on your industry, some customers like that functionality. It's a great time saver, but there are industries, for example, in healthcare and financial services, where you have a regulatory environment where you have to have officials sign off at different points. And before you officially move something to the next status, you have to have a sign off and you have to have a review for it. And if that's your methodology, you'd want to turn off those options. And then lastly, we do have a time tracking feature, which I haven't really shown you yet, which I'm going to do next. There is that, do you want to have a time tracking available for the tasks for the incidents? And also when you create tasks, do you want a default value for their estimate? maybe all tasks, unless you specify, will start out being 6 hours. And the last piece then, after the administration, is the time card. So going into the time card view, any tasks or incidents that are assigned to me as a user are displayed here, and this is a nice time saver. So rather than having to click through all the different options, all the different requirements and tasks and defects, I can directly add in here how much time is available, how much time is remaining. And so, for example, we spent 1 hour, the 6 hours remaining. Maybe we worked it for 1 hour, and if I hit save, it's going to then update that. And there you go. So there is that time card feature. If I log in as other users that have got work assigned to them, you'd see more things. So for example, if I log out as the system admin and log in as Fred, and go to my time card, I will see different items like that. Some of these are from the library system, some are from the the current project. So you can see there's one from our project. And then the nice thing for this also is if you've got developers or analysts or testers working on different projects at once, they can enter all their time centrally for all their projects. And it highlights also which ones are late. So when you see the reds, you know that's something they need to be working on, acting as a further visual cue. Well, that's the end of today's presentation on the Agile planning functionality of SpiraPlan and SpiraTeam. Any questions from anyone who's attending? Well, great. Well, thanks so much for attending the Inflectra webinar on SpiraTeam and SpiraPlan Agile Planning. Our next webinar, which will be in 2 weeks' time, is going to be on mobile testing using Rapise to test applications running on an iPhone, iPad, Android device, and how you can use the new mobile testing features of Rapise to better test and automated test your mobile applications. So we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, and thanks so much for attending. If for any reason any of your coworkers wanted to see this, we will be publishing this on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.